Well, hello and hello. It is not every day that a new encyclical comes out, and it gets us in theology and religious studies all excited. Uh, Especially when it's the first one from a new pope. You get a sense of what they're up to, yeah? And so since it's the end of May, beautiful day, I don't have any students I can talk to this about. My colleagues are all out. I can't talk to them. I have to talk to somebody. So I'm going to talk to you as we maybe look through this document and pull out some of the very interesting things. So you might ask, though, why? Why? Why does this matter? So let's just say quickly, these are important documents that direct the thinking of the Catholic Church. Yeah, and the Catholic Church is about 1.5 billion people or so, about 17% of everybody. So if you are Catholic, you already know why this matters. If you're not Catholic, hey, guess what? 70% of all your neighbors are impacted by this, and especially in the United States. Because Catholics are disproportionately represented in the U.S. government, especially on the Supreme Court. Something like 2/3 of the Supreme Court are Catholics, and the Vice President of the U.S. is a Catholic. It matters for how they will engage with the world, what resources they're drawing on, what ways that the Catholic Church is trying to, as Leo emphasizes throughout this document, partner with the world, be a member of a global community, be a conscience that speaks to everyone, not as a authority from above, but from living within, living alongside of, living with. That's a huge emphasis of the beginning of this whole wonderful text. Let's go right up to the top here. Magnifica Humanitas. Ooh, it's a great name. Magnifica Humanitas. Yes, and in case you don't know, that is Latin from the first phrase of the encyclical. That's always how these great documents work. The title comes from the first line. Humanity created by God in all its grandeur is today facing a pivotal choice. Humanity, grandeur, there you get the title, Magnifica Humanitas. So there's your 1 and 2 reasons for caring. Third reason, maybe you're a student of mine that I'm making watch this video at the beginning of a semester to reflect theologically about the usage of AI in your education. Yeah, and I don't even like to say AI. It's not really artificial intelligence. About large language models being used in your education. Maybe I'm making you watch this. That might be fun. We'll see. So here I am with all my books, right? Intelligence. You remember that guy? This is funny. Do you remember that guy? Oh man, years ago, used to have ads on everything. He was showing you a picture of his Lamborghini, and then he's like, "But what I care more about is knowledge." And he turns and he's got this whole line of books. He's like, "These are the bookcases I had installed." Remember that guy? I don't remember anything else about him. But it's funny that that guy who was selling a course about how you can be successful and intellectual like him, that's basically the entire economy now is guys like that. All right, well, let's get to it then. What is it when I read through this document that leaps out to me as a theologian who has been working in Catholic spaces, especially for 10, 15 years now? Yeah, we'll see. So right from the beginning, yes, we've got this imagery that's going to reoccur throughout the entire encyclical. The comparison of the Tower of Babel, yeah? And this is great imagery. In fact, I wish Leo had used it more. It sort of drops off a little bit in the middle and comes back at the end. I think it could have flowed even more deeply into the work of the whole encyclical. In fact, I think he could have gone even further with the context of the story because he speaks so much about war and powers and dominant political forces on earth. The Tower of Babel story doesn't just start with the Tower of Babel. It starts maybe the chapter before in Genesis 10, where you have this figure Nimrod arise, who's this mighty warrior, the text says, and he founds all these imperial cities, which just happen to be all the major capitals of all the empires that the people who are writing these texts have been dealing with for their entire cultural existence, who founds all of these capital cities of these great empires of the Middle East, of the ancient world. He's their founder, and it's his organization of things, this political, imperial, conquering organization of things, which goes on to set the context for the building of this Tower of Babel. It's not just a project done by people generally. It's a project in the context of an imperial conquest. Yeah, that ties in a lot with the situation that Leo is going to be describing. The same goes for the alternative vision, his sort of doing his own St. Augustine, two cities, two comparisons. You can be like the Tower of Babel, or you can be like Nehemiah, returning from the Babylonian exile to rebuild the city of Jerusalem, rebuild its walls. And that's some great imagery that's going to come up later on. We've got this line, I just have to say, noting, considering the debates between Protestants and Catholics about the interpretation of a line where Jesus speaks of Peter as the rock on which he will build his church, and Protestants debate that Christ was referring to just his proclamation that Jesus was the Messiah, that he's going to build it on that. And Catholics will say, no, he's talking about Peter himself, and hence have a justification for the office of the Pope, from whom Peter is the originator, to put Christ as the living stone here. Very interesting. We could talk more about that. But if I stop at every single one of these paragraphs, we're going to have a real problem. Centralization of Christ here in these first two paragraphs that you always want to see in a Christian document like this. One that's beginning with the central doctrine, the central dogma of the incarnate God who had a human life and a human death and a resurrection that informs what our lives should look like. That's really Christianity's strength. And he also sets the stage down here for why this encyclical is so important. In section 4, he says, today, however, we find ourselves facing a new situation. The power and prevalence of emerging technologies are interwoven into the fabric of daily life, shaping decision-making processes and deeply affecting the collective imagination. And he quotes, never has humanity had such power over itself. That's a daily felt reality for us. When I ask my students what the most worrisome or dangerous thing they're facing, their generation is facing, the majority opinion always is about technology. Some will mention climate change, others will mention divisions, but overwhelmingly, it's always about technology. In fact, my most recent class that just wrapped up, they all said social media. Never had that before. The entire 22, 23 students all said social media. And of course, he needs to make clear that this is not just a Luddite text in which he's saying all technology is bad. And that's what he does here in 9, right? He's setting up all the directions that he's not going to go. In the abstract, he says, technology in and of itself is not a solution to humanity's problems, just as it is not inherently evil. In practice, however, notice this clear distinction. Sometimes we like to think our tools are completely neutral. That when we make a tool, it's just if I use it badly, then it's a bad thing. If I use it well, then it's a good thing. The Pope wants to make a more profound point than that. Tools are not necessarily neutral things. In the abstract, sure, we can think of it that way, but in practice, he says, however, technology is never neutral because it takes on the characteristics of those who devise, finance, regulate, and use it, right? So he's saying these are not the kinds of things that we can just abstract about in the ether and think about the pieces without thinking about the very real historical circumstances in which they occur, in which there are people who make the technology, to finance it, regulate it, and use it all for particular purposes. Therefore, the primary choice is not between a yes and a no to technology, but rather between constructing Babel or rebuilding Jerusalem, between a power that claims to dominate the heavens and a people who work together in the presence of God to rebuild the walls of fraternal coexistence. And then I think right here, section 10 kind of, it's one of those key texts. It's doing a lot of the carrying. It's carrying forward the sort of thing that will be through the entire encyclical. We should read it in full. He says, we must then avoid Babel syndrome, namely the idolatry of prophet that sacrifices the weak, a uniformity that neutralizes differences, and the pretenses that a single language, even a digital one, can translate everything, including the mystery of the person, into data and performance. Yeah, this is his real problem. It's going to come up later when he talks about the technocratic paradigm. The risk of dehumanization, of building a future that excludes God and reduces the others to a means, is an ancient and ever-new temptation that takes on a technical guise. Instead, let us choose what he calls the way of Nehemiah, to rebuild these walls of Jerusalem in the Hebrew Tanakh, which highlights the importance of working together to make the city of God a safe place for returning exiles. Rebuilding today means recognizing that precisely from the plurality of voices and visions, which, even though they sometimes remind us of confusion caused by the diversity of spoken language, a bright possibility emerges. Indeed, this is the possibility of building together, of transforming diversity into a resource, and of making listening and dialogue the common ground upon which to cultivate justice and fraternity. This issue of plurality and multitude of voices, and listening to those voices and finding a way to harmonize those voices to find unity in difference, not by eliminating difference, becomes an absolutely key guiding principle of this encyclical, and often of Catholic social teaching. That the goal is not to flatten out all people into one kind of people, but rather to find the harmonious relation among them all. Within this shared task, Christians discover their unique role of guiding actions toward God so that in his light, pluralism does not dissipate into disorder, but instead through the practice of synodality, which is church governance from below, listening to groups of members of the church who come together on a particular task in order to inform the direction of the church, rather than simply the church being directed top down by the magisterium, the teaching authority. It becomes the space in which humanity rediscovers its solid foundations and its final end. In the book of Revelation, John sees the New Jerusalem, quote, coming down out of heaven from God as a gift for all humanity. And this vision of grace is an invitation for us Christians to work together in order to foster a peaceful, just, and dignified life and community within today's cities. I do want to draw attention to here in section 13, he's got such a great definition of subsidiarity, a great example of subsidiarity. Subsidiarity, as he'll explain later, is one of these principles of Catholic social teaching that basically says the lowest level of authority should do a thing if it's capable of doing that thing, right? So if you can do it as an individual, or if you can do it as a family, or if you can do it as a citywide community, that should be the people who do it and not some higher authority, yeah? You should find the people closest to the ground, in a sense, to resolve any given social problem, rather than rely on maybe a distant, larger authority. They have their place. They should do things, but not necessarily everything. And here he gives the example, taking from the building of the wall of Jerusalem, that everyone is given their own section of the wall. Scientists, researchers, entrepreneurs and workers, educators and legislatures, civil society, popular movements, faith communities. This is the logic of subsidiarity, which values the cooperation between generations, peoples, disciplines, and cultures as the best way for fostering stability, prosperity, and peace. In section 19, we get really powerful Vatican II energy, even just from this title of A Church Journeying Through Human History. He's already placing the Catholic Church within historic time frames and contexts, right? He's putting it as a part of history. That's already interesting, unique, and important for a Catholic encyclical to do. Not uncommon, but certainly representing a sort of Vatican II energy, post-Vatican II, post-modernization of the church type of sense. He says the church is present in the world as a sign of unity for the entire human family. She recognizes today's questions and challenges as the current setting in which to carry out her particular vocation of listening, dialogue, and service, and of being responsive to everything concerning the lives of contemporary men and women. This is involvement for the lives This involvement in people's lives helps the church understand ever more clearly that her mission has a historic scope and entails a responsibility for the way in which social relations are built. Pope Francis, he says, emphasized this historical dimension of the church's mission. No one can demand that religion should be relegated to the inner sanctum of personal life, without influence on societal and national life, without concern for the soundness of civil institutions, without a right to offer an opinion on events affecting society. Yes? And I think that this is so important. This is something I try to communicate to my students all the time. Religion is not a segmented part of your life. I have a video on this, Faith and Reason. Go check it out. Religion is not a segmented part of anyone's life. Everyone has a religious outlook to the world, something they think about ultimately, something they think about as the meaning and purpose of what they're doing here. Everyone has that. It's what directs your life. It's what informs your politics. It's what informs your orientation to the world. Yeah, it's sort of like what Leo says down here in 23 when he says the church regards all who sincerely seek truth, goodness, and beauty as companions on the journey and consider them precious allies in defending the dignity of every person and in caring for creation. This follows the pastoral approach of the Second Vatican Council. This is great. This is what I mean. Everyone has an idea of truth and goodness and beauty somewhere in them. Something that is real and accurate, something that they are pursuing, and something that directs and inspires them. Yeah, these are the transcendentals of being, as the tradition, theology, and philosophy have called them. The things that are in all being, the things that we all seek, the things that we all want. This is what I identify to students as the heart of the study of theology, is what is truth and goodness and beauty? What is ultimately important? What ultimately matters? And so Leo is positioning this encyclical to say this is not just narrowly for the religious and our own pious, separated, isolated lives. He's saying this is for everybody. And we consider allies everyone who is also interested in pursuing a world such as this. That includes you, whoever you may be. This encyclical is written to you. Now, I want to point out something very interesting he does, because he starts to move toward describing Catholic social teaching and how it works. And he does this fascinating thing because he picks up from Pope Leo XIII, for whom he is named and has clearly taken a lot of inspiration. It seems that the way Leo XIV looks at this is he looks back to Leo XIII, who was Pope in the late 1800s, Pope in the midst of tumultuous change in human society, the fallout of the Industrial Revolution, the full settling in of modernity, the total revolution of economic relations had been already happening for many hundreds of years, but was only becoming more and more entrenched in day-to-day life, capitalism and its operations on the earth, liberal politics and democracy, all those sorts of things. And Leo XIV seems to have taken his name precisely because he sees today a new moment like the late 1800s, in which new ways of living, new ways of relating, new ways of human society organizing are on the rise, and they need to be thought about. They need to be reflected on. They need to be critiqued. They need to be subject to, as he will emphasize again and again and again in this encyclical, emphasize on moral evaluation. That they have to be directed by humane purposes, that we can't let these technologies run themselves or run according to maximal profit logic. They have to be run according to humane oversight with the purpose of the human common good, dignity, solidarity, these principles he's going to describe soon of Catholic social teaching. And as he goes through all of this, as he steps through these various important papal figures who have done encyclicals, he does this fascinating thing at the end of each one where he basically pulls out what he thinks are the most essential strands from that person. Yeah, he's going to pull out, let's see down here with when he officially gets into Leo, for example, he's going to say, many conditions have changed. Right? So he's sort of, at the same time as he's emphasizing the tradition, he's also saying we have to recognize these are not necessarily eternal and absolute descriptions of how human life should be lived. They're responding to particular historic moments. They are conditioned. They're drawing from, and Leo would say this, he says this, they're drawing from eternal principles. They're drawing from unchanging principles like the essential reality of human dignity, the need for human solidarity, the reality of subsidiarity, the truth of the universal, uh, it just escaped me, destination of goods. But the actual practices are not necessarily going to hold. So he's at the same time saying, here's what remains and here's what changes. Here's the essence, here's the development. So he then points out there's always at least two insights that remain relevant today. The primacy of human labor over any mindset focused solely on finance or productivity, and the inseparable link between proclaiming the gospel and pursuing a more just social order. And so he's going to go through each of these papal predecessors of his and point out, here's what I think remains. Here's what I think is the essential strand that is still in continuity today. And so taking from Leo XIII in his encyclical Rerum Novarum, which sort of begins the Catholic engagement with the changes of the modern world, considering that before that you had Pope Pius, who wrote the Syllabus of Errors about how disturbed modernity was and incompatible modernity was with Catholic life. We don't need to get into that now. Something I was interested to see is that in talking about Paul VI, he brings up Populorum Progressio, and he brings up Octogesima Adveniens, and points out that Paul VI, the most demanding legacy is that as long as there are people in the world who are excluded from the development befitting human dignity, the Christian community cannot be content with the theoretical proclamation of peace. Rather, beginning where people are marginalized, it must allow the gospel to pass judgment on those economic and political structures which can become veritable, quote, structures of sin. As a result, no person or people will be treated as expendable in the processes of development. I mean, what you've got here is basically the preferential choice for the poor, in which the Catholic Church in its social doctrine teaches that those who are marginalized, those who are victims, those who are on the bottom of society, those who are on the outskirts, they have something especially important to contribute, and they need to be listened to. They need to be elevated. They need to be concerned with those people, the people who are being excluded. That's another great theme that runs throughout all of Magnifica Humanitas. The whole thing is filled with a concern for those on the edges. But what's interesting to me is just as much of what he brings up from all these popes, also what he leaves out. Paul VI, he does not mention Humanae Vitae, known famously for its forbidding of contraception, which has been immensely controversial in the Catholic Church and was from the very beginning, because it was sort of, it concluded an opposite from what the commission put together to study contraception by the Catholic Church had concluded. So there was some tension there, that because a sexual act, without getting all into it, according to Catholic social teaching, is meant to have the double ends of unity and procreation and sacrament. It represents the relation of Christ with his church. And the unity and intimacy, connectedness, oneness. And if you remove the procreative aspect, you're doing something corruptive to the act itself. So goes the argument in Catholic social teaching. So it's interesting to me that Humanae Vitae does not show up here. That is not to say I'm not a newspaper or an article monger online that's going, Pope Leo has abandoned the Humanae Vitae. No, I guarantee he certainly affirms it. But the fact that it's not being emphasized, that's very interesting. That's very interesting. But on the other hand, sometimes Humanae Vitae is not really considered as much part of the social teaching as it is part of the sexual ethics and the theology of the body and family, which they could be categorizing differently. So I could be overreacting. I'm just always on Humanae Vitae watch. Above anyone, beyond anyone, you do a search and you're going to find that more than, I think, any other person in this entire encyclical, Leo quotes from Pope Francis. Yes, and this is huge. This is big. Because Pope Francis was obviously, as you may know, a little controversial, a little divisive within and outside of the church. Yeah, he could just say things sometimes and people would be like, huh? What's he saying? Is he changing something? What does he mean by that? And sometimes it was sort of an off-the-cuff thing that he would have to clarify later. Other times he would double down and say, no, I am saying that, in fact. I am, in fact, saying that you might be able to reconsider how you give the Mass to remarried couples, provide the Eucharist to remarried couples, or maybe our approach to LGBTQ issues can be adjusted a little. Uh, or maybe I'm just going to say the death penalty is impermissible anymore, as he does in Fratelli Tutti. But Pope Francis, controversial. And so when Pope Leo was elected, the question before Pope Leo was being elected was, is the conclave going to go with another Francis? Are they going to try to moderate? Are they going to try to retreat to something a little more conservative, for lack of a better word? And when Leo was elected, he was a little bit of an unknown figure. People weren't quite sure 100% what direction he was going to go. And this encyclical, I think, conclusively demonstrates that while he may not be as off the cuff as Pope Francis was, he's still pressing in the Pope Francis direction. Yeah, he's still pushing on the same things that Pope Francis was most concerned with. And that shows up in the content of the encyclical, but it also shows up in simply the number of times that he quotes Francis at length rather than anyone else. Yeah, and that really the pieces of the prior popes that he pulls out to say as continuity in Catholic social teaching, they're all very Francis-y. We don't have time to go into a whole theology of Francis, but you can certainly find that yourself. Chapter 2 of the Foundations and Principles of the Social Doctrine, which is incredibly useful. This could be taught very well as a summary to students who need to learn about what is this unified system of approaching the world that we call Catholic social teaching, a massive category of ethical and political concern, economic concern, all sorts of concerns. What is it? How does it function? And he does obviously a stupendous job summarizing it, I think. I want to draw attention here to his emphasis of the human person as the image of the triune God. Yeah, so he's getting a little bit emphatic on human relationality, which is something I always appreciate. I think that that's a fantastic way of approaching the human being, not just as a being who has relationship, but as a being that is constitutively relationship. That seems to me to be the fallout of the two claims in Christianity that God is relationship, the Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, that God is relationship itself, love itself, and that humans are made in the image of that God, that there's something about us that's intrinsically relation. Yeah. And that's what he says here in 48, 49, and 50. The church's social doctrine brings us to the very heart of our faith, the mystery of the living God revealed in Jesus Christ, who, as a communion of persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, is love itself in relationship, expressed in the mutual gift of self and in sharing with the world. Boom. Great summary of the fundamental dogmas of Christianity. As the council recalled, human persons are called to communion with God and can fully discover their true selves only in sincere self-giving. Indeed, their deepest vocation is to enter into the Trinitarian dynamic of love received and shared. If the mystery of the God as love is the source of the social doctrine, we see its most concrete expression in the face of Jesus Christ. So once again, a return to Christology, a return to Christocentrism. That's so important for Christianity, oddly often overlooked. By becoming man, the Son of God enters our history and takes on human flesh, bringing with him the love that unites him to the Father and Holy Spirit. In him, the mystery of humanity becomes clear. This is a very interesting claim of Christianity. As someone who studies Christianity, a very interesting claim of Christianity is that what is human is not necessarily defined by what's at the beginning, but what's at the end. That is to say, the human being is defined by the incarnation, by comparison to Jesus, rather than as having its own sort of intrinsic humanness. It's a very interesting thread you can trace through theological history. Human dignity does not depend on a person's abilities, its wealth, their position in life, nor on the right or wrong choices made. Instead, it is a gift that precedes and transcends each person, endowed by God as an expression of his unfailing love. There's the heart of the Christian claim and Catholic social teaching's claim of human dignity. Yeah, that what a human being is not to be evaluated by what they do or what they have or how they live, but by the intrinsic value they have simply for existing. Simply for having been created and having been loved. Loved to the point of, as he emphasizes here, Christ dying for the good of humanity. That's the Christian understanding of things. So it's very lovely to see that always emphasized at the foundation of the claim for human dignity. And so he goes on for a while here describing the fundamental right of human dignity as the central point of Catholic social teaching that cannot be erased, cannot be put aside, cannot be violated. Among these rights, the first is the right of life from conception to its natural end, without which it is impossible to exercise any other right. And when this fundamental right is denied, as it is in the case of induced abortion, killing of the innocent, and euthanasia, we are faced with choices that the Church considers gravely wrong. So here he now brings up an aspect of Catholic social teaching, which reveals a division in how Catholics interpret Catholic social teaching, right? So you have these principles: dignity, solidarity, universal destination of goods, solidarity, and so on and so forth, a subsidiarity. But for some Catholics, the cash-out value will then be emphasized on being anti-war or anti-exploitation, or calling out particular structures that cause violations of these principles. On the other hand, you might have Catholics who take those same principles and use them to emphasize issues like abortion and euthanasia. Yeah. You can see here that Leo is once again not the newspaper headline, Pope Leo abandons traditional Catholicism. No, he's still in opposition to abortion as understood by life beginning at conception. That's a classic Catholic understanding of the human person. But it also is not emphasized in this encyclical. This is the only place where it is directly mentioned. And so once again, you're left with this very interesting tension where Leo is not dismissing it. And he certainly is in opposition to abortion. He's the Pope. That's a sort of an incredibly important part of Roman Catholicism, regardless of how you evaluate it. Yeah, I think there's a very fascinating debate to be had about when a human person begins, and then if we can even know the beginning of a human person, what that cashes out to in concrete political value. Because it may be the case that even if you think that abortion is the killing of a human being, you may not want it criminalized because the criminalization of it will only make it worse, or the consequences will only worsen the circumstance rather than actually end it. That criminalization is not the way to end abortion, even if you believe abortion is the killing of a genuine human being. And that depends on your development of when a human person becomes a human person. Christianity has always opposed abortion historically. You can trace this all the way back to the early church. But what they mean by that is not always the same. When a human person begins was a debated topic, with some people saying conception, other people saying, like Thomas Aquinas famously, several months in, or at least several weeks in, and and women take longer to become persons than men. I'm just reporting what Thomas Aquinas believed. And so you get a debate about what it means. And while Christianity would always have affirmed against it, because at the very least, abortion is about a possible human being, the clear definition of what exactly a human being is and begins, that's been a little more uncertain in Christian tradition. But anyway, it's just interesting to me to see this come up here, but then not anywhere else. Yeah, that is important for Leo, but it's not his major priority, right? Which in part is because this is not an encyclical about abortion. He talks about the common good, right? We don't need to go into the details about all of what each one of these mean. The common good that is good for all people, the fundamental, where is it? Total sum of the conditions which allow people, either as groups or individuals, to reach their fulfillment more easily and more fully. Quick and dirty definition by the Second Vatican Council. He talks about the universal destination of goods. Very fascinating to me, right? That while there is a right to private property, which has its own specific meaning and purpose, it is always subordinate to the universal destination of goods, always. Now, this is interesting, once again, because this has been a sort of, in the Catholic social teaching tradition, a little bit of one of these, sometimes emphasized, sometimes not. And it goes all the way back to Pope Leo XIII, who we've already talked about in his encyclical Rerum Novarum, which was about the circumstances of workers and how workers and capital owners and businesses should relate to each other. And in that encyclical, many who read it notice that it sort of mixes together an understanding of property taken from Thomas Aquinas, who says that everything has been given to by God to everyone to share, and that private property is only a useful way of making sure it's used well, but it's not a good in and of itself. It's just instrumental. It's just conventional. Private property is not an essential right. It is a secondary or even tertiary right to enable everyone to get what they need, to enable the common good to happen. And if private property is getting in the way of that, then it doesn't count as private property anymore. This is Thomas Aquinas famously arguing that in need, all things are common. If someone is in need of food and someone else has more food than they need, it's not theft for Thomas Aquinas to steal, to take that food for your own need, because in need, all things become common, because private property only exists as this secondary right. But in Rerum Novarum, you also get this idea of property taken from John Locke, the famous, one of the most famous philosophers of liberalism in modernity. And Locke argues, and we have to simplify it for the sake of time, but Locke argues that yes, God gave everything in common to people, but once I take my inviolable self and my labor, which I have authority over, and I mix that labor, he says, with some part of the world, that part of the world becomes mine by extension. It becomes part of my private property because I have mixed my labor with it. A lot of criticism of this, a lot of debate around how this works out and what it means and what it looks like. That's a whole different thing. But that language also shows up in Rerum Novarum, in that encyclical by Pope Leo XIII in the late 1800s. And there's this fascinating, sometimes tension in it between the Thomistic and the Lockean aspects. On the one hand, Leo does emphasize that property is for the sake of the common good. On the other hand, he says that private property is inviolable because the laborer has mixed their labor with it. It's inviolable. It's sacred, right? It's a first order kind of right. He sometimes talks about it that way. There's a little bit of back and forth within that encyclical. Tension. Sometimes it's more Thomistic. It's for the common good. It is secondary. It can be violated in times of need. It is not absolute. And other times it's talked about as if it were absolute. He uses the mixing metaphor. That's what makes private property. And that's not at all what Thomas Aquinas argued. You get some popes who will try to emphasize the Thomistic part again, some who will bring back a little bit of the Locke part again, make private property a little bit higher of a right. It is more like John the 23rd and Paul VI, who re-emphasized that no, property is a secondary third right. It's not the most essential thing. It can be violated. In fact, they maybe had some ideas about how and it could be expropriated for the common good. And you get sort of a little bit of a reaction in John Paul II, who elevates the dignity of property a little bit higher again. Not absolute, always says that it's for the common good, but it's a higher conception. And here Leo is continuing what Francis did with private property, which concerned a great deal many people when Francis was arguing this in his two encyclicals. And he talks about it in Fratelli Tutti and in Laudato Si, that private property really is not essential. It's useful. It can be useful, but it's not the most essential thing. It's not the most meaningful thing. It's not how we direct or organize ourselves by who has rights to what. Certainly there is a right to private property, which also has its specific meaning and purpose, yet it is always subordinate to the universal destination of goods. Yeah. And so if some people are not getting their very basic needs met, then private property is not our major concern. Private property can be violated for the purpose of the universal destination of goods, which is good for all people. And this is going to come up again in this discussion on AI, because he talks about data as property. He talks about the work of the AI and the people who make it happen, how that relates to private property. Private property is going to continue to be a massive question in the digital age. And so it's really excellent of the Pope to make sure it's related here. As Pope Francis reminded us, he said, when lived out in its fullest sense, that the social function of property is, quote, to restore to the poor what belongs to them. And that draws on an ancient tradition around property that goes all the way back to the vast majority of the early Christians who either explicitly shared their goods in common, or the later church fathers who argued vociferously with great urgency and sometimes even severity about how if you have more than you need and someone else needs it, you are stealing from them by keeping it. John Chrysostom comes to mind. Gregory of Nyssa comes to mind. Ambrose of Milan, who this is almost directly quoting from, comes to mind. Many, many church fathers were emphatic that you, in possessing more than your neighbor, can in fact be harming them, taking from them what is owed to them. And this, of course, draws on the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, to loan without expecting return and to give to those who need, to share your coat, your cloak, to feed the hungry and give water to the thirsty and visit the prisoner. I mean, these are fundamental things from the Gospels. Subsidiarity, we already talked about this a bit. He just defines it again here. Great definition, great evaluation of subsidiarity as a principle of who has responsibility for what. What level does responsibility fall to? It should always fall to the lowest to the ground, the people who can do it best, unless they can't do it, in which case it will have to become the responsibility of some larger organization. Yeah. Principle of solidarity, yes. Another common essential aspect of Catholic social teaching. I don't know if he quotes it exactly, but it is the firm commitment to the common good. As fraternity is not merely an aspiration of believers, but a political and social reality to be embodied in communal choices and endeavors. Solidarity, then, is the concrete recognition that the future of each individual is connected to the future of all. Indeed, he quotes Francis here, no one is saved alone. Powerful line that ties into his point earlier about human dignity being relational. Human dignity is relational. No one can be saved alone because we are all bound together. My good depends on your good. Your good depends on my good. They're not two separate things in competition. Yeah, so solidarity is the recognition of the common good and the firm commitment to it. Principle of social justice. This is what I mentioned earlier as the preferential choice for the poor, in which you must be especially concerned with those, particularly the weakest, who are unable to access that which makes for a truly dignified life. He's quotes from his predecessors all about it, about the concrete support for those at the bottom to restore dignity and a voice to those who have been ignored, fostering healing. The litmus test, he says, for social justice today is the treatment of migrants, refugees, and those forced to move due to poverty, violence, climate change, and environmental disasters, right? This is picking up a very essential modern concern of the Catholic social teaching of the Vatican. This was, Francis's, aside from the environment, perhaps Francis's number one issue. The first place he visited during his pontificate was Lampedusa, an island in the Mediterranean that was a common stopping ground for migrants fleeing from the Middle East and Africa for Europe. And as you well know, I'm sure, the political climate in the United States and in Europe especially, but in all sorts of places across the world, have become heavily anti-migrant, anti-refugee as of late. And it was a deep concern of Francis to ensure that migrants and refugees were seen with the same human dignity that everyone else has, welcomed in the same way that you would want to be welcomed if you were forced to move due to poverty, violence, climate change, and environmental disaster. And indeed, this is full of foresight because this isn't going to slow down. If we are unable to slow the climate crisis, if we're not able to stop the cycles of violence and war, we are only going to see exponential increase in movements of people from places where it's just simply not feasible to live anymore. And so it's another example here of how Leo is carrying forward the concern of Francis, that Leo is looking to Francis as a primary inspiration, right? Answering that question that many people were asking, what direction is he going to go? And he also, thankfully, diagnoses that this social justice also means the right to stay in one's homeland in peace and security by addressing the root causes that force people to migrate, including those linked to economic injustices and climate crisis. This is essential. It is true that you can't solve the refugee crises by just moving people. That's you got to. The Catholic Church teaches to welcome them, treat the stranger as if they were one of your own. That's almost word for word, not just the teachings of Jesus, but something you see across the entire biblical canon, all the way back into the depths of the Torah, is to welcome the stranger. That's one of the highest Semitic virtues that there are in the Middle East and in all of the traditions. You see the same thing in Islam and Arabic traditions. You see the same thing in both Christian and Jewish traditions. The welcoming of the stranger is essential. But Leo wants to also say that this means that they have a right to stay where they are because they're not just moving because they feel like it. They're moving because circumstances have forced them to. Yeah, economic injustice, uneven development, global free trade that makes life much more exploitative and extractive in some places, such as South America, than it is in other places, such as in North America. These uneven distributions of ills are exactly the kind of thing that Pope Leo is pointing towards and saying that if you want to really fix the refugee crisis, it's going to take welcoming these refugees, treating them as fully dignified human beings, these migrants as if they were you, but you got to fix the root cause. That's the point of social justice. That's why this section is titled Social Justice. If you can get social justice in which there is equitable development and defense from the climate crisis, such that people don't need to move, well, as he says, when these rights are respected, migration becomes an opportunity for encounter and mutual enrichment among peoples. There's a great value on diversity in this text. Diversity in harmony. That people together are capable of teaching and learning in ways they never could alone. Once again, that relational aspect is integral. And speaking of integral human development is the last part of the discussion of social goods that Pope Leo takes up of the Catholic social teaching. And integral development is the concern for the integral development of the whole person. The Catholic social teaching says it's not just about being able to make possible someone's material standard of living. It's about their psychological, spiritual standard of living. It's about their whole development as people. It's about them becoming capable of responsibility as well. It's not about, let's see a good line here. He says, today the concept of integral human development is a benchmark for the evaluation of integral ecology, which has become an indispensable dimension of the Church's social doctrine. That's directly from Francis. That is Francis's Laudato Si. Boom, that's what it's all about. Indeed, the quality of development is measured by the ability to integrate justice toward people in the care of our common home and to promote dignified living conditions, access to necessary goods, just social relations, care of creation, and consideration of future generations. These are all the things bound up in our relational nexus, and to leave any one of them behind, Leo is saying, would be to have a less than integrated human development. And it's also worth noting here, as he has a portion here about specifically addressed to the church, because these encyclicals are always addressed to all people of goodwill, human society, the world, but also specifically to the church, of course. He does mention, where is it? Subsidiarity in the church as governance and pastoral life involves supporting and recognizing intermediary organizations as they carry their responsibilities, valuing their charisms and skills, and avoiding any form of paternalism that suffocates evangelical freedom. In practical terms, the participation of the baptized in decision-making processes and their shared responsibility in the mission are achieved through genuine rather than merely nominal participatory bodies. This is big for the movement of synodality in Roman Catholicism, yes? Roman Catholicism has a long history of top-down organization, very monarchical in nature. The medieval popes functionally were monarchs, part of the reason that Pope Leo XIII produces an encyclical like Rerum Novarum about these economic relations is because he's one of the first popes to be pope without being the king of land, without being the feudal lord of territory, right? The previous pope had lost that territory to the newly developing Italian nationalists. And so this idea of a monarchical church authority that rules downward and people just sort of receive what the church pours down on them rather than being participants themselves. That has been a real dynamic within Roman Catholicism. And ever since the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s, there's been an increasing emphasis on lay person participation, lay person decision-making. How do the baptized participate in decision-making processes? This was, again, a major concern of Pope Francis, synodality, that you get the people together, you get them talking about what the problems on the ground are, and then you bring those up to the leadership of the church, who is bound in some way to engage with them. Now that becomes a much trickier question about how and when and why and to what extent and what actually binds them to do that. But once again, we see here Leo picking up on an essential part of Francis. And he links it to subsidiarity. That subsidiarity means that lay persons should be participating. What are we at here? What time have I made this? Oh my God. Chapter 3, Technology Dominance. The point is about artificial intelligence now, yes? The point is about artificial intelligence. And he brings up the technocratic paradigm from Pope Francis, once again, that our globalized world has a tendency to let the logic of efficiency, control, and profit alone shape personal, social, and economic decisions. That's key. That's the enemy that Leo wants to do something about. And he notes here in these sections about how our tools help us or do not help us in that capacity. That our tools, especially our modern, all-pervasive tools, tools that impact all parts of our life, they shape us. We make our tools, as the old saying goes, and then they make us. And that's his great concern with artificial intelligence, is that when our tools make us, we become less human and more about efficiency, control, get out of here, Bing. Control, my God, and profit. Those become the overarching concerns. And now he addresses specifically in 100 the key risks, three major ones. Well, actually, 99 is a better place to start because 99 is where he makes the key distinguishing mark between what is human and what is an artificial intelligence. I think 99 and 100, if you're concerned with the artificial intelligence portions of this, these are the key parts. He says, it is not possible to provide a single comprehensive definition of AI. What can be stated, however, is that we must avoid the misconception of equating this intelligence with that of human beings. These systems merely imitate certain functions of human intelligence. In doing so, they often surpass human intelligence in speed and computational capacity, offering tangible benefits across many fields. So he says there's good things. There's good things. It's not all bad. There's good things. Yet, this power remains entirely tied to data processing. So-called artificial intelligences do not undergo experiences. They do not possess a body. They do not feel joy or pain. They do not mature through relations and do not know from within what love, work, friendship, or responsibility mean. Nor do they have a moral conscience, since they do not judge good and evil, or grasp the ultimate meaning of situations, or bear responsibility for consequences. They may imitate language, behavior, and analytical skills, or even simulate empathy and understanding, but they don't understand what they produce, for they lack the affective, relational, and spiritual perspective through which humans grow in wisdom. Even when these tools are described as capable of quote-unquote learning, their way of doing so is different from that of a human person. It is not the experience of those who allow themselves to be shaped by life and grow over time through choices, mistakes, forgiveness, and fidelity. Rather, it is a form of statistical adaptation based on data and feedback, which can be very effective, but does not imply inner growth. Oh. That is the heart of the encyclical there. He's built up to this whole point about what makes for a human being, what is a fulfilling human life, what is human dignity and its relation to subsidiarity with a common good and solidarity and the universal destination of good with a social justice concern for the poor. And then he pulls up to AI and says, it can't do any of that. It can simulate it. It can look like it. But it is incapable of love, friendship, responsibility, experience, bodiliness. He emphasizes being a body. That's important. They don't feel joy or pain or mature. They simulate, and they work on statistical adaptation from data and feedback. But that's not inner growth. He's saying that's not what a human being is or does. In contradiction to some people who do claim that these machines are becoming human and function in human ways. Some who are simply proclaiming it, that they're this close. If you just give us another $1 billion, we're this close to making an actual artificial general intelligence that can be its own thing. Who, some of them believe that. Others just need the next round of fundraising to go well. To others who, the more day-to-day experience of having this machine talk to you and your brain just feels like you're talking to another person. And so you just project personality onto this thing that's just built to feed back to you whatever you sort of said to it, designed to satisfy you. Or, most famously, I think Richard Dawkins recently, from me recording this video, did an article where he famously, the new atheist Richard Dawkins, incredibly influential evolutionary biologist, very thoughtful person, said that he talked with the AI Claude for 3 days and couldn't identify it as being different than a personal intelligence, and so he came to believe that it has something like human intelligence. You're seeing these divisions and these approaches appear everywhere, and Pope Leo is staking out a clear ground by saying, here's the specific ways that being a human being is different than what this is. And it's bound up with all the social doctrine he's already established. Now he turns to the major risks. What's the concern here? In light of what has been said, we can better understand why AI can be a valuable tool and at the same time why it calls for a measured and vigilant approach. In recent years, its private use has expanded significantly, prompting growing reflection on the opportunities it offers and the risks tied to its rapid spread. And he's concerned with 3 in particular. Number 1, the ease with which results are obtained. Number 2, the impression of objectivity. And number 3, the simulation of human communication. Yeah, these for him are the 3 major concerns. What is the worry with artificial intelligence being propagated? And he says the first is the ease with which results can simply appear. The speed and simplicity belies the complexity underlying the results. Yeah, it undoubtedly makes life easier, he says, yet it can also encourage excessive reliance and search for ready-made answers, which weakens personal creativity and judgment. This is what I'm telling you in my classes. This is what I'm telling you is there are many good things. I use large language models for many simplistic tasks, but when you use it to replace the search for answers, when you use it to replace the questioning, you weaken yourself. You replace yourself. You're basically saying, oh yeah, I'm not necessary to my own life to figure out the meaning of it, the purpose of it. Number 2, the Pope says the apparent objectivity of the responses and the suggestions these systems provide lead us to overlook that they reflect cultural assumptions of those who designed and trained them, right? These systems present themselves as objective. Oh, here's the answer. And sometimes it can give a good answer, but we always have to remember that those answers are not dropped out of the heavens, but they are picking up all the same biases and all the same unquestioned assumptions of the people who make them and the data that it draws on. Yeah. And lastly, the artificial imitation of positive human communication, advice, empathy, friendship, even love can be genuinely helpful, engaging at times. However, for less discerning users, it can be misleading and create the illusion of a relationship with a real personal subject. And you see this happening only more and more, where people are using AI. And I think the statistics bear this out, that the number 1 use for AI is therapy, counseling, and various sexual gratification desires. All things that are fulfilled by human relationship, but are now being mimicked in the form of an artificial intelligence. That's what the Pope is concerned with here in his 3rd point, that it can easily substitute the painful friction, the often not 100% comfortable interaction of persons with persons, but there's a value to that, a genuineness to those friendships and relations that an artificial intelligence that just says back to you whatever you said and affirms you unquestioningly can never imitate. Real, true, genuine, risky, vulnerable human relations. Indeed, he says, they may gradually lose the very desire to form it. And then last in 101, he emphasizes the environmental impact of AI, which always sits behind the scenes, right? We only see more and more headlines about how new data centers are going up that are sucking local power grids dry, using up local water supplies, increasing our power consumption incredibly, such that we're worsening the climate crisis by exponential amounts because these machines require such intense data processing power. He does not want to leave that aside either, the environmental impact for the help of our common home. And then he moves on to ensuring that there must be responsibility over these systems. Once again, that our tools cannot just be allowed to make us, but instead we need prudent, rigorous evaluation and at times even a slower pace to adopting AI, which he says does not mean opposing progress. We don't need to go full speed into the unknown. We can slow things down to ensure that humanness, humanity, human values, in the Pope's case, divine values, which he doesn't see as two different things, are able to guide and restrain and restrict the process. He said, and he emphasizes here that moralizing these machines, putting moral guidance to them, is not sufficient if it's only the morality of a few. A more moral AI is not enough if that morality is determined by a few. He's calling for something like a democratization of artificial intelligence, that it's not sufficient that these can just be opaque products made by private corporations whose only obligation is to maximize economic return profit to their shareholders. These should be overseen by the morality of humanity at large, not just the moral priorities of the designers. Yeah, that's a key point there. Indeed, he points out in 108, we will simply be repeating an age-old mistake that with every major technological shift, AI will tend to amplify the power of those already possessing economic resources, expertise, and access to data. In light of the common good and the universal destination of goods, this raises serious concern, since small but highly influential groups can shape information and consumption patterns, influence democratic processes, and steer economic dynamics to their own advantage, undermining social justice and solidarity among people. What a great sentence there to see for yourself how he's applying all of those key concepts of Catholic social teaching. He says, look, if only a few people control this advantageous development, it will only amplify the power they already have, which will wound the common good and the universal destination of goods, because now the property is being used for their private benefit and not for the benefit of all, which is the purpose of private property in the Catholic social tradition mostly. And that these people can then shape how the technology is used, which impacts democracy, impacts the economy for their own good, which can undermine the social justice that's meant to attend to the least, and the solidarity that's meant to find in others your common good. So it's just a great little, if you want one little sentence, 2 sentences, 3 sentences, that's going to be like, here's an example, there it is. So in 110, he talks about the need to disarm AI, which means freeing it from the mentality of armed competition, which today is not limited simply to military context, but also economic and cognitive, right? He's identifying that in modernity, we are competitive creatures in need of constant competition, not because anyone sits out there in the competition of a baseball game and says, oh, I just want to play and have a fun time by a fun competition, but rather the kind of competition that is forced on us, because if you don't compete well enough, you die, or you're excluded, or you lose out on essential needs of life. Everything is bound to this competitional logic of capitalism. Yeah, it's a fundamental tenet of capitalism is competition. And what Leo says here is the task is to disarm, meaning not to reject, but to prevent it from dominating humanity, to free technology from monopolistic control and opening it to discussion and debate, and therefore making it human-friendly and restoring it to the plurality of human cultures and ways of life, right? Not a closed-off competition, but something that is for everyone. Or else, He's concerned we will find a normalized anti-human vision. Yeah. In that vision, the fullness of life is equated with having more, reducing weakness, eliminating uncertainty, exerting total control. When efficiency becomes the ultimate measure of value, human beings are tempted to see themselves as a project to be optimized rather than persons calling for relationship and communion. Oh, there it is again. You can see this logic coming up. The human as a relational being is most essential for Pope Leo and in the Catholic social tradition. And that if you follow this anti-human logic, this technocratic paradigm that optimizes human beings for maximal efficiency in competition with each other, you'll be thinking about life only in terms of having more, of being less weak, of eliminating uncertainty and exerting total control. And what you find there is that's, for him, he's going to go on. These are all topics he'll bring up again later on about how these are essential parts of life. But we can just point out here that if his concern is persons called to relationship and communion, these four things are essential to relationships and communion. You can't have a true relationship unless you are weak in it. You can't have one. A true, earnest relationship means you have a weakness. That other person can hurt you horrifically. It also means embracing uncertainty because you never know another person perfectly. You always have to commit to them, have faith in them, despite not knowing them perfectly and absolutely and being certain that they'll always do things that you will enjoy and like. Uncertainty is a part of relationship. Doubt is a part of faith. And you cannot exert total control over someone and call that a true and earnest relationship. You cannot use a person like that and think that it is a mutual exchange of communion or of love. Satisfaction, weakness, uncertainty, lack of total control, those are essential things for human relationship for Leo. And he sees the concern of technologies like artificial intelligence moving us in a direction in which we'll lose that. In which we'll find those to be things to be eliminated in the name of efficiency, rather than values that need to be embraced for a full human life. And that is exactly what he exposits all the way from 118, the limit, heart, and grandeur of the human person. Oh, if only I had time to read the entire thing, but the whole point of this video is not to read the entire thing, but to make commentary on it. I can't resist. But he goes in here and he explores all four of those in here to show how our limitations enable our compassion, that we are fully human in those limitations, not by destroying them, not by overcoming them, that even in the face of evil, humanity is able to know itself in its vulnerability. It goes on in a beautiful way. This is one of the more beautiful sections, I think, of the encyclical, really getting at the heart of Leo's understanding of the human person, what makes us Magnifica, in the name of the title, in which God has come to dwell. It all gets summarized here in 126, where he says, in this intertwining of just institutions, credible witnesses, and daily fidelity that sustain hope and provide clear direction for technological progress without allowing the heart to regress. For this reason, humanity, in all its grandeur and its woundedness, must never be replaced or surpassed. We can embrace the technological progress that alleviates suffering and unlocks new possibilities, provided that we do not abandon the very essence of our humanity, namely the capacity for relationship and love. Another one of those sentences where you're like, boom, there it is. Grab that, pull that out, summarize, highlight, underline, bold. That's the Pope's concern. That's the Pope's concern, is that there's something of grandeur and woundedness in humanity that might be damaged by our technological progress in this digital age, our capacity for relations and love. Another way he summarizes this is a couple sections down in 129, where he says, the key question remains the one posed by St. John Paul II. Does AI, quote, make human life on earth more human in every aspect of that life? Does it make it more worthy of man? If the answer is yes, then we can recognize it as an opportunity to be embraced responsibly on the path of patient shared reconstruction akin to the rebuilding of Jerusalem in the book of Nehemiah. If, however, power grows while the heart withers and human bonds fray, then we are faced with a new form of Babel, a construction that is grandiose yet fundamentally dehumanizing. Those who command powerful technological and economic resources along with substantial human capital for intervention possess significant capabilities for influence and cultural change. Ultimately, they can influence a significant number of people concerning the truth about humanity, the world, the meaning of existence, the family, and even God. This is pure power detached from truth, which subtly or overtly imposes what it wishes upon others to accept as true. At its root lies a deeper and often unrecognized sickness, the fact that, quote, modern man is wrongly convinced he is the sole author of himself, his life, and society. This is a presumption that follows from being selfishly closed in upon himself. So he points out that possessing great power is often deeply isolating. It leads you to think that you are the one who makes yourself, that you are a perfectly isolated and autonomous individual. But that's been the whole thing the Pope has been arguing against. You're not. You're intimately bound up and dependent with other people all the time, constantly from the beginning. And so technology, he warns, as with mass economic resources, when you're very, very rich and very, very powerful, you get to pretend like you're not. And you can do a great deal of harm to the world in that sense. Great deal of harm to the world in that sense. Worth pointing out, and he points out how that is, it brings people closer and closer to falling into totalitarian regimes. 138, he praises journalists in particular for playing a crucial role in bringing injustices and abuses to light. And he quotes Pope Francis saying, I also thank you, a journalist, for what you tell us about what goes wrong in the church, for helping us not to sweep it under the carpet, and for your voices you have given to the victims of abuse. And then he says, we must remain vigilant and transparent for the grave responsibilities in the church itself. And so he's still dealing here with the abuse crisis, right? The Catholic sexual abuse crisis of this century that has done such profound damage to human lives, foremost, and then secondarily to the reputation of Roman Catholicism in the world. That is still a concern for Leo. It is still on the plate, and needfully so, because it is still a serious trouble. It is still a serious problem. I am particularly a fan down here of the sections on education, given that I love education. He points out all the same kinds of things that I think about all the time. Let's just look at this here. Education is a long journey requiring patience. It is not digital media. It is not immediate. It is not satisfaction right away. It is not dopamine hit, dopamine hit, dopamine hit, so you keep scrolling. It is a long journey requiring patience. That's what life is, and therefore needs time for development and engagement with reality beyond appearances. Educating people about the use of AI involves teaching them to decide when and for what it ought not to be used. The speed and ease with which answers or summaries can be obtained extinguishes the desire to ask questions. I've experienced this, which is a process that bears fruit only over time. As Plato wrote, the deepest and most important things are learned only after much time and effort, by engaging in discussion with others, striking upon ideas and experiences together like flint on the spark of understanding until it is kindled within us. That is what we must learn to do. And then he goes on to talk about the negative impact of digital devices, especially from an early age, on sleep, attention span, emotional control, relationships, with tragic consequences. Simply true. The science bears this out. The ways that our tools are shaping us and the ways we're letting our tools now shape our children is tremendous. Grooming, blackmail, sexual exploitation, fake profiles, algorithms that facilitate dangerous content, AI tools of manipulating images and videos. It's all just a rush for attention. It's all just a rush for efficient competition, which decimates what Leo sees as the human essential dignity. Later on, he starts talking about work and the deep concern now of artificial intelligence to replace human labor without any kind of alternative. I mean, wouldn't it be great if it could replace human labor and then those people would be fine still? But we have no system for that. We have no way of handling that many people who are now considered worthless to an economy run on profit, but there's no purpose for them anymore. That is Leo's great concern when he criticizes these economic systems, because they see people as profit mechanisms and not as people. That is, they work for private good, profit, and not common good, the dignity of all human beings. Again, you can see all the pieces of Catholic social teaching reappearing and reoccurring over and over and over. For technology to relieve the humans of arduous, repetitive, and dangerous tasks, and to provide intelligent support for human activity. But the irreplaceable role of the individual must remain the general rule, right? So good, yes, have humans do less of the mindless, repetitive, arduous labor, but don't take their humanity from them. Because Catholic social teaching also has a long history of work as a good thing. It's not punishment for human sin, but there's good work to be done in the world that is fulfilling to human beings when it does this. And this is another interesting tension in Catholic social teaching, because on the one hand, telling people in a capitalist society that work is theologically good is another sort of divine right of kings. Obey the king because God makes him king. Oh, you have to labor because it's good to labor. Sort of the Marxian critique that religion is an opiate to the human condition, so such that humans don't realize they're being exploited. They don't realize class consciousness. They don't realize their common good against the bourgeois, the rich, the capitalist. But on the other hand, the point of the theology of labor is not quite to say that, though it could be construed that way. It is instead to say that labor is a good thing for human beings. Human beings are meant to do things. We are satisfied in facing challenges and overcoming them. We are fulfilled in working attentively on something that we pour ourselves into, that we create. A very important part of Catholic social teaching. And so he sees AI not just as a practical threat, to my particular job or your particular job that might be replaced, but an existential threat to what it means to be a human being if we replace labor entirely. Yeah, work is a part of being human, according to Roman Catholicism. 160 to 64, he takes up a discussion of credit, which is very interesting to me personally as someone who has studied and written on this, that he notes here, the social function of credit remains irreplaceable. Finance for its own sake is fundamentally different from finance aimed at development, creation, and evolution of work. This is a tension also in the Catholic tradition, in the Christian tradition as a whole. Until, from the very beginning of Christianity until, and this goes true for Islam, who's actually continued this attitude to the present, and it's also, you can see it in Judaism. Interest on debt is seen as fundamentally corruptive, even evil. The church fathers spoke of it this way. The reformers spoke of it this way. Thomas Aquinas spoke of it this way, that there is something evil in the idea of lending someone money and expecting them to give back more to you than what you gave to them. There's a wide amount of literature on this. It's fascinating to think about that this was an opinion of people who lived 500-600 years ago, when today nothing is more fundamental to this economy, to our global life, than interest, than that you loan someone money and they use it for something and you make more of it back. That's what everything is based on. The entire stock market is that. The entire mortgage sector is that. The entire banking sector is that. Everything is financing. Debt. That's what enables such growth. But up until the 15 or 1600s, a little bit sooner than that, the scholastics were beginning to adjust. But the 1500s or so was about the time when people went from saying lending money with interest, usury, is bad, but here are some exceptions, to saying lending money for interest is fine, but here are the abuses. That was a major shift that occurred around that point. And it was essential in legitimizing the rise of modern capitalism. And so you see today this tension throughout the Catholic tradition as well between defining what exactly do we mean by usury. And a lot, meaning lending at interest. And a lot of that has to do with the argument that, well, today you can lend money that creates more money for everyone. That's what Leo is referring to here. Whereas in the age of the church fathers, you didn't lend money, and that created more development for everyone. They didn't go out and build houses that could be used for other people, or go out and build businesses, or go out and farm that can produce more produce. They needed to just cover their sort of day-to-day debts, and so you were being directly exploitative of them. They needed the help, and you were not willing to give it except in a way that benefited you. Defenders of usury and interest say that, well, now you can actually lend money in a way that helps the person you're lending it to and helps you and can help everyone. Development, creation, evolution of work. I think this is debatable. I think this is a debatable point. I'm not convinced that that's entirely what the major concern of the church fathers or Thomas Aquinas or any of the pre-modern thinkers on this were concerned about. There's something about, for them, the lending of money to someone and then expecting a return that treats the other person as if they were an enemy, an outsider, as not your fellow human being with equal dignity, but someone other than you, whom you can reap benefits from. The same goes, again, for the church fathers, as they railed, and I mean they railed, they hated, some of them, Martin Luther also and Calvin too, basically said that there's nothing worse than a usurer who lends money at interest, except for the devil. Because they saw it as such a horrific abuse of your fellow human. An abuse of what money was supposed to be for, which is not to create more money, as it does today in our modern world, but rather to satisfy use values, things that people needed. And so, as I said, I think there's a genuine tension here. And the Pope is embracing the modern formation, that credit can be used for beneficial goals, but there are some abuses for it. That's just an interesting thing to point out here in the background, as we've been doing this whole time. I mean, what else have I been doing, huh? It does lead one to question, and this is a tension also in Catholic social teaching, between capitalism and Catholic social teaching, because the Catholic social teaching is constantly criticizing capitalism, managing its symptoms, but seems to maintain that there is an inherent okayness about its functioning if that functioning is restrained. Yeah. Most of the Catholic social teaching documents, all the ones by all those popes, criticize something like socialism as inherently disordered, or at least socialism as it was practiced in like the Soviet Union. They carved out a different kind of socialism, which they said was much closer to Catholic social teaching. Socialism was commonly seen as more inherently disordered, whereas capitalism was seen as instrumentally disordered. And so there's a constant tension in criticizing all the symptoms of capitalism, basically, but without criticizing capitalism itself on its own terms, in its own nature. That's a very interesting background reality. As we proceed, what else do we have here? The family as a central good. Yes, and here again we see another appearance of what is for some people the essence of Catholic social teaching, but is on the sidelines for Leo. It's there, but it's not a major idea, just like it was for Francis. The family is a primary social good. Founded on the enduring union between a man and a woman, it is the first environment in which all persons develop their potential. So there is Catholicism on LGBTQ issues. Marriage is still between a man and a woman. Its fundamental nature is for heterosexuality, even though people who want to emphasize it as the most important part of Catholic social teaching are going to be dissatisfied that it only shows up here in this line for Leo. Once again, Francis made some pretty startling statements around LGBTQ issues that, despite some reporting to the alternative, never was him saying, oh, I love it, totally fine, whatever, it's all good, but him moderating on certain approaches or sharpening, or sanding off certain sharp edges, so to say, about the role of LGBTQ relationships in the church. Something like permitting civil unions but not blessing them as marriages was something Francis talked about, which may have been impossible to imagine for previous popes. Here we have, I'd mentioned before, concepts of ownership. It comes up here, 171 to 172, digital ownership. And he tries to bring back in the universal destination of goods to argue that at the root of these problems lies a technocratic and post-humanist mentality that tends to regard the human person as an object to be manipulated or a resource to be optimized, removing all safeguards against the unchecked pursuit of profit. That's not necessarily John Locke, but it's a little bit of his inheritors, that human beings are property to be used. They're just property of themselves. What prevails is efficiency rather than respect for freedom and dignity. Some post-humanist currents go so far as to envision second-class human beings subordinate to the interests of elites who consider themselves superior, right? He's also now been discussing transhumanism and post-humanism, different philosophies that undergird technological development about how we can make human beings transcend our mortal biological condition, often termed in phrases of uniting us to machines, putting our consciousnesses into machines, or approaching a moment of singularity in which our technology is so advanced it rapidly reproduces itself and develops its next development, and humanity becomes completely irrelevant to the aims of the technology we have created. That's some of the stuff that goes on here, and he's trying to challenge those perspectives. You sometimes see this presented, especially by the Silicon Valley elite. Peter Thiel, perhaps being the most famous. Elon Musk talking in terms of, maybe humanity is not that valuable. Technology and its development is most important. Maybe there are some people who should survive and other people who are parasites. This is what he's concerned with, these new mentalities of subordination. He brings up a fascinating point here that people often don't think about with AI is the human labor that goes into it behind the scenes. Children and adolescents in dangerous conditions, crushing the material from which rare elements are extracted, or the labor that is mind-numbing about identifying, data labeling, model training, and content moderation, which often involves disturbing material. There are whole reports and stories you can read about this, the human trafficking that goes on, all the parts of the supply chain for artificial intelligence that are abusive to human life, that treats human life as if it was slave life. I mean, perhaps no commodity has ever been more fetishized than artificial intelligence. It is built for commodity fetishization. And if you don't know what that means, commodity fetishization is most famously the concept of Marx, in which he identifies commodities, which are things that are traded around on a market for value. They have exchange value. You can buy them with money and then have the thing, but then sell it again for money. It's basically things become exchangeable for money. Money equals things. That's a commodity. A commodity which is then fetishized. It's a commodity that is forgotten as a commodity anymore. It's not treated as a product of human labor that took this work and this investment and this productive capacity to make it. It's treated as a thing in itself that sort of bestows value to you. It's made into a fetish, not a sexual fetish, although some do, but into a object of veneration, something that brings meaning into your life by its consumption. Yeah. You know what I'm talking about. Watch any advertisement and you see commodity fetishization. You watch a car ad, they're not selling you on the benefits of the car. They're selling you on the experience of the car, cruising through tundra or back roads with your friends, right? Any advertisement is selling you on the feeling. That's very akin to commodity fetishization. The commodity is not purchased for its use value, and it's not treated or thought of in terms of its use value. It's treated and thought of in terms of its feeling, what it brings into my life meaning-wise. And the reality that it's a thing made by human labor in historic conditions is pushed aside. AI is the quintessential example of that because it appears so human. It's so easy to commodify. No commodity has been more fetishized because it just presents itself as a human being. It presents itself as if it has intelligence. It presents itself by directly giving you emotional experiences that you want to have. And here, Leo is doing great work in dragging AI back down to the ground to say, no, look, it is a product of human labor, exploited human labor. It's a product of human labor. You have to recognize it in its wholeness. You have to think about it as the thing that it actually is, not the thing that it makes you feel. You have to think about it in its reality, not in its commodification. And this enables him to turn to a unexpected discussion of actual historic slavery as well, where he, in fact, in 176, which may become, I'm sure, and is already being received as one of the more controversial lines in the whole encyclical, that the church has come to deeper awareness gradually of the gravity of these issues in the development of her doctrine. So already Leo is touching on a fragile place where Roman Catholicism seems to claim that it has a transhistoric insight, that across all of history, Catholicism has had a privileged view of things because of its relationship to God, to Jesus, to the Holy Spirit, that its teachings are in a way infallible. It's way more complex than that, way more dimensions to that, but there's a huge emphasis in Catholicism on tradition informing practice. And here, Leo is talking about the development of doctrine, gradually deeper awareness of the gravity of these issues, that on something like slavery, he's saying the church had a wrong view, and that view had to develop over time to realize the right view. He's talking about a shared discernment and sidestepping all the sort of common ways to say, oh, well, yeah, the church wasn't obviously teaching that, but it was always sort of there under the surface, and that would be able to defend the tradition. He's just sort of straight up saying, it's true that events can't be judged anachronistically. People in the past had a normalization for certain things, yet we cannot deny or diminish or delay what has come to be denounced as the scourge of slavery. He notes that in antiquity and the Middle Ages, many even ecclesiastical institutions had slaves. In the early modern period, the Vatican itself, the Pope, responding to the requests from sovereigns, intervened several times in order to regulate and legitimize forms of subjugation, and in some cases the enslavement of, quote, infidels. This is just simply the case, especially when you look back to the papal documents in response to the discovery of the New World, which he cites here in these footnotes. In answer to the kings of Spain and Portugal, the Pope is saying, yeah, here are the rules and how you are allowed to enslave the peoples who live there. Now, there are other popes in that era who go, well, wait, you didn't mean it quite like that. Maybe you should do it like this instead. But none who come out fully and say unequivocally, slavery is wrong. And this goes all the way back to the New Testament, the biblical text. You don't get that there either. You get principles that could undermine slavery. You get the Apostle Paul saying that there is no slave or free in Christ. You get him in the book of Philemon declaring that the slave should be freed. You have him telling slaves to try to become free if you can. You have him... the Apostle Peter, or whoever wrote the book 1 and 2 of the Petrine epistles. You have in one of them him listing slave traders, those who traffic in kidnapped people, as those who will never see the kingdom of heaven. But on the other hand, you have the Apostle Paul still speaking to slaves and saying you should obey your masters, you should respect them, you should be good slaves. And he tells the masters to be good masters, but he doesn't explicitly always and in all cases say slavery is wrong. Even if he lays the foundation for saying so and in sort of resets the relationship, the church inherits this and sticks to it for 1,800 years. It was only in the 19th century that a formal, absolute, and universal condemnation of slavery was clearly articulated, notably under Leo XIII. And this is true. But by the end of the 1800s, when Leo made this, slavery was already mostly outlawed in most places. In fact, he was writing about one of the few places that was only most recently banning it, one of the final countries, Brazil. So at that point, it was sort of a little bit late to the game. Yeah, a little bit late to the game to be proclaiming the absolute futility of slavery when slavery has already been eliminated, legally at least, in most countries. And again, he refers to it as this development, offering a clear example of the church's growth and understanding the perennial truths of revelation that she safeguards, that the church has a revelation from God, but grows in understanding it. We are not always consistent in the practice, given that slavery was long tolerated before being unequivocally condemned, and there has been a continuous affirmation through history of the dignity of every human person created in the image of God, even if it took 18 centuries for its full incompatibility with slavery to be explicitly recognized. This constitutes a wound in Christian memory, one from which we cannot consider ourselves detached. It is impossible not to feel deep sorrow when contemplating the immense suffering and humiliation endured by so many in stark contrast to their immeasurable dignity as persons infinitely loved by the Lord. For this, in the name of the church, I sincerely ask for pardon. This had been a concern of Leo even before he became the Pope. He himself has black ancestors, which is a fascinating side story here. A wound in Christian memory. And so he says the church has this revelation and this reality, this recognition of human dignity, but it took this long for it to be recognized that it's incompatible with slavery, absolutely. That there's no kind or form or shape or position that slavery can take in which it's compatible with human dignity. But it also points to a certain problem in Catholic social teaching that is recurrent, which is it sort of is always playing catch up. It's always sort of playing catch up. It's always claiming, as the Christian ethicist Stanley Hauerwas once said, it's always claiming to make a civilizational critique. It's always wants to levy a social critique, but never so much that it actually completely invalidates whatever the status quo is. So there's always a certain kind of lag that has been sometimes by some identified in Catholic social teaching, like Leo opposing slavery after almost everyone else has made it illegal. You can see this in multiple instances of Catholic social teaching saying this, but only after it's become more normalized in the wider and broader culture. This seems to be a tension that Pope Francis and Pope Leo have both concerned themselves with, especially, is maybe getting ahead of the curve, so to speak. So a fascinating, fascinating paragraph, bound to be extremely controversial in those who want to insist that the church cannot develop in any way or gradually come to a deeper awareness that it always opposed slavery incipiently. Not quite the case. And once again, these footnotes are great. You should look at them. They make fantastic points. What are we at now? Oh boy, can I do it in 2 hours? Let's make it less than 2 hours. Now he begins to take up the question of war here. What is the intersection of war and digital revolution? And this is tremendously important. As he points out right away in 182, 183, he brings it up a couple more times. AI is being used in warfare. We can actually see this now, especially it's especially obvious and forefronted in the United States and in Israel, who use artificial intelligence to identify targets and to execute them. That it's the job of an AI to gather intelligence together and say, yes, that person is worthy of being killed. That person is worthy of being killed. That person is worthy of being killed. And this is horrifying to Pope Leo. He doesn't mention anyone by name, but it's certain he has these kinds of stories in the background. As he says here in 197, the unceasing development of weapon systems involving AI, the Holy See has recently observed that the growing ease with which autonomous weapon systems can be deployed to make war more feasible and less subject to human control. This violates the principle that armed forces should be used only as a last resort in cases of legitimate self-defense. He recognizes that AI is playing deadly roles in human life. That we're leaving the authority of taking a human life, adjudicating whether a human lives or dies, to a machine that is burdened with all of our biases and none of our humanity. That could not be more of a violation of human dignity for Pope Leo. I think of the story here of that George Orwell tells of when he was in the Spanish Civil War. Yes, that George Orwell. He was in the Spanish Civil War, and he says he was there with his gun, and he saw one of the enemy combatants, one of the fascists, running on the nationalist side, running along, and his pants were falling down. And he was running, trying to hold his pants up. And Orwell says that he could not shoot him because in that moment, he saw him as another human being. Weak and vulnerable. He couldn't see him as a heartless, monstrous enemy who deserves nothing but torture and death, which is, of course, the necessary logic to sustain warfare. They have to be monsters if we're going to kill them unilaterally. But what Orwell sees in this moment of intense moral vulnerability is just another human being, and he can't bring himself to pull the trigger. no level of artificial intelligence could copy. It could not possess that kind of mercy. It will only follow what it needs to follow according to the prerogatives given to it, which become isolated from our own human compassion. In 192, Leo writes about he's been analyzing cycles of violence, very similar to Francis's argument about warfare in Fratelli Tutti. Cycles of violence, the way the war never solves the problems it claims to solve, that every war always claims to be a just war and validates itself, but in fact it's always invalidating, and so on and so forth. He says, today, more than ever, without prejudice to the right of self-defense in the strictest sense, so he says strictly, yes, self-defense is fine, but it has to be really in true self-defense. It is important to reaffirm that just war theory, which has all too often been used to justify any kind of war, is now outdated. Humanity possesses far more effective and capable tools for promoting human life and resolving conflicts such as dialogue, diplomacy, and forgiveness. The use of force, violence, and weapons reflects a relational poverty that always has disastrous consequences for civilian populations. That's a huge deal too, because it's the Catholic tradition, St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas, who developed the foundations of just war theory, saying that a war can be just if waged by legitimate authority for the right purpose, with the right proportionality, and so on and so forth. There's, many, many different principles that go into just war theory argued about it. But Leo just sort of does this almost the exact same thing that Francis did, and Francis was heavily criticized for it, in just sort of cutting through all that and saying, no, war is futile. It's useless. It never solves what it claims to solve, and trying to figure out what a just war is just makes everyone claim that their war is just, and no war is so just. Even the wars you could argue are the most self-defensive still involve people on the defensive side using disproportionality. The Allies in World War II, the bombing of Dresden and Tokyo and the nuclear bombs were not necessary, strictly speaking. They were not capable, you cannot evaluate them as aspects of a just war. They were indiscriminately killing civilians. That default makes the war unjust. But Leo just simply says in a sentence what Francis expounded on in Fratelli Tutti, that the just war theory is just outdated. It's outdated, he says, which again proposes a challenge for those who want to seek a very simplistic continuity of Catholic teaching, who want to say, well, it was always taught just war. Leo says it's now outdated. It's not useful anymore. Now, interestingly, that's not him denying that it was ever useful. This is sort of the same move that Francis makes, that maybe at one point in the past it could be useful. He's saying now it is no longer useful. Now we don't need it. And that leaves a bit of strategic ambiguity as to whether he's condemning just war theory entirely or whether he's just sort of saying it's not necessary anymore. It's not helpful anymore. People will debate endlessly about that, I'm sure. But it's a point that he has spoken on in his public statements on various wars and conflicts today in the same way that Francis did, both of them getting sort of criticized for saying, regardless of the source of the war, it will lead to worse results. It will lead to worse results. It will always degrade humanity. It will always damage the people who participate in it. It will always leave the world worse than it was before. It will always repeat cycles of violence. It will always reproduce, as he puts it up here, simplistic narratives, friend and foe mentality, disinformation, and fear. It conditions people into a worse and worse way of living. And so, very controversially, he's going to say just war is outdated. But later on, in one of the paragraphs we're reading over here, in 199, he provides criterions of discernment for responsibility in using AI in warfare. That just sounds like something like a just war theory. That, okay, he said, just war is always bad, don't do it. But if you're going to do it, here's at least some basic criterion. That just sort of sounds like just war theory in a different shape. Yeah. The second criterion pertains to the moral time frame for making judgments. AI expedites the process, speed and efficiency, but speed and efficiency shouldn't be the supreme motivating force for the irreversible decision made in the context of war. That's a fantastic principle. That's a fantastic guiding principle. When you're deciding whether to kill someone, speed and efficiency should never be the primary goal. But that does sort of exist in tension with his claim that just war theory is outdated. He's providing principles that are not unlike principles you would see in just war theory. So I'm very interested to see how this will play out further on in Leo's pontificate and in the work done around his encyclicals, because that tension is still there. He's not getting rid of it just by saying, just war theory is outdated. The achievements of humanitarian law are also being compromised. Indeed, the principles of proportionality in responding to aggression, the protection of access to water, food, and essential goods, and the respect for the lives of civilians, especially children, are considered naive relics of the past, right? But he clearly in here has in mind the several significant war experiences occurring in the world right now. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the Israeli and U.S. attacks upon Iran, the absolute genocidal devastation inflicted on Gaza by Israel, and the genocidal famine circumstances of the civil war in Sudan. And this is all in the name, as I said, of this realism, he calls it a false realism, based on a mentality of force, but on a cultural and anthropological belief that war is inevitable and a part of human nature. Yeah. This is a concept of what a human being is that goes back forever, but its most famous proponent, in modernity is probably Thomas Hobbes, who famously argued that the state of nature for human beings is constant warfare, constant conflict, for everyone to try to grab a little bit more for themselves, and that it's the danger of that which drives men into civil society and forcibly give up all their power to one sovereign ruler so that they can live in some measure of peace. Leo acknowledges in 205 that this is a way that people approach the world, but he insists that it is not the most basic reality. Peace is neither a naive hope nor merely the absence of war. Instead, it is always possible as the fruit of justice and charity. The reality of what a human being is, he thinks, enables human beings to be more than warfare. We are not fundamentally war-waging creatures. We do wage war, but that's a corruption and a damage to what we are and should be. It's fueled by desire for possession, a will to dominate, hegemonic ambitions, abuses of power, fear of those who are different. But that isn't how it has to be. We don't have to keep making wars that, as he puts it here, make fertile ground for new wars that are perhaps even more dangerous than those of the past, right? All those wars I listed earlier, when they're over and done, if they are, they've already planted the seeds for new war in the future. The people whose children were slaughtered, blown up, dismembered, murdered, shot in the head. If that doesn't set up the circumstances for a future war, what does? He condemns decisions made exclusively by economic calculation and justified by media distortions that justify further violence. We must not normalize these realities. We have a reason for hope. We can build what he calls a civilization of love. And here's probably the third most talked about paragraph, where he quotes from Gandalf. Although with a strategic dignity, he doesn't say it's Gandalf, which I think is very funny, that he's going to quote from Tolkien, a famous Catholic author, but avoid getting too much in the weeds that, Gandalf, the word Gandalf is going to appear in a papal encyclical. Very funny. He says, the 20th century Catholic author J.R.R. Tolkien, in the words of a protagonist of one of his novels, described our responsibility in this way, quote, "It is not our part to master all the tides of the world, but to do what is in us for the succor of those years wherein we are set, uprooting the evil in the fields that we know, so that those who live after may have clean earth to till." That's his vision of a world beyond the realist assumptions about warfare and the necessity of conflict and the necessity of competition. That's the kind of way of approaching a world where the civilization of love can arise, not from a single and spectacular gesture, but the sum total of small and steadfast acts of fidelity that serve as a bulwark against dehumanization. I mean, that's the whole message of The Lord of the Rings, right? That's the point of the Hobbits. That's what Sam says in all the moments that make people cry in the movies, let alone in the books. It's that which moves the world forward towards a civilization of love. And it's that kind of love, because of how he's already defined human dignity and its nature, that sits deeper than our capacity for war. Yeah. And I think that then, therefore, we should end this with looking at the points he asks us to reflect on. Yeah. Because he sends this all to all people of goodwill, is how most of these papal encyclicals are addressed. Not just the Catholics, but all people of goodwill. So let us all look at, first, he says the need to disarm words. Yeah, the first contribution towards a human civilization is to be mindful of our words. Words have enormous power, and they can change our mood for better and worse. Peace begins with each of us, the way we look at others, listen to others, speak with others. This reminds me of the famous philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, who, coming out of the camps in World War II, writes a philosophy that prioritizes ethics and says that the face of another person commands me to ethical responsibility before anything else. Before any other part of me is me, before I exist as a me, the other person commands me to ethical responsibility. That I am at the very beginning a relationship being that has ethical obligations to another person. And that sets us up for what the capacity, if we're able to disarm our words, we are embracing a world of attempts at trust, attempts at risk, to take responsibility for others, rather than to assume positions of fear, competition, and warfare towards others. We need to disarm ourselves of our own tools, is really what Leo is arguing. And he says we must then build peace through justice. Yes? Do you want to attain peace, he says, quoting from Augustine? Then practice justice. That true peace only comes out of justice. This goes back to his whole discussion of war. You don't get peace at the end of war. You get this, maybe the cessation of conflict, but you don't get peace where people live together well. Justice. If you want people living together well, you must make the world more just so that people are not driven to the kind of conflict required in the face of injustice. Thirdly, he wants to ask us to adopt the perspective of victims. And this is absolutely essential. He says when we witness the bombing of civilians or attacks on hospitals, schools, or vital infrastructure and violence that affects children, once again, he's clearly talking about the many stories we have heard of the conflicts and wars and genocidal activity going on presently. We are confronted with scandals that wound humanity itself, and therefore we cannot limit ourselves to abstract analysis. Pope Francis encouraged us to touch the wounded flesh. Yeah, this is very insightful, to take the perspective of victims, and it plays into the preferential choice for the poor, the social justice that we talked about earlier. To pay attention to those voices, to see the wounds of those who have been damaged, shows us, as he says down here, that humanity does not desire war. We are not essentially war-making when you look at the wounded and you feel with them empathy and compassion. You can see this example in the American Civil Rights Movement, which he cites in here. When people could see with their own eyes on a television screen the kind of violence that was required to enforce segregation, it was much more difficult for people to defend it. And they began to turn, slowly but surely, against it. You can see the same thing going on in Gaza. And the Palestinians are seen as victims because videos of their deaths, videos of their loss, videos of their destroyed land flowed through social media. Israel admits as much. They say they lost the social media war because people saw the on-the-ground consequences for 2 years, and they couldn't help but have compassion and a sense of indignancy at injustice be evoked from them. Leo is making a profound point that when you see the world from the perspective of the victims, you are expanding your relational capacity and therefore expanding the capacity for hope. To make sure the cries may become an appeal for peace and harmony and not a prelude to new conflicts. And he says we must cultivate a healthy realism. This is a mixture, he says, of a certain kind of pessimism, a certain kind of optimism. Yeah, that we cannot be too idealistic and we cannot be too cynical. Cynicism kills hope and idealism kills reality. We must be more hopeful than anything. Authentic realism that does not give up on changing the world, but one which also precisely recognizes its reality. One which does not selectively take facts and distort and rename them, but one that does not surrender to violence. And last of all, he says we must revive dialogue by listening to each other. An attitude that seeks to forge bonds of fraternity built on listening, an open demeanor, making time for each other. And this might be my favorite line, actually, of the entire syllabus, the entire encyclical, and even wasting time together. Oh, there's something powerful in that recommendation. The story Attack on Titan, I've talked with some students about it recently, so it's on my mind. Attack on Titan is such a fantastic story about this, breaking the cycles of violence by reviving attempts at dialogue and humanizing the other person, which comes from only listening and openness, making time, and even wasting time together. There's something beautiful about just being with other people, wasting time with other people. There's something good to that, the Pope says. In rejecting the mindset of violence, interreligious dialogue plays a decisive role. Because at the heart of the great spiritual paths lies a message of peace. So now he's opening this up to religious dialogue, saying in all religions there is a spirit of peace. And in all of them, there's also a spirit of violence. We could talk about every single religion's history with violence, legitimating it. But insofar as a religion is often and regularly used to legitimate violence, make it seem normal and necessary, which is all too common for every religious tradition, it can also be used to inspire a message of peace. And you see this also in every religious tradition. I will give the last word to Leo. He says in 233, as a believer among believers, I invite everyone to contemplate in the face of the Son of God the grandeur of humanity, the Magnifica Humanitas, that shines a light also on the era of AI. In Christ, we are called to cooperate in the work of creation rather than be disinterested observers of technological processes that limit our freedom and responsibility. The dignity inscribed in each of us by the Holy Spirit can also be seen in our capacity to reflect critically, choose and love freely, and form authentic relationships. No computational system, however sophisticated, can create a heart that gives itself, or a conscience that discerns good from evil. Even when machines excel in efficiency, a human face that asks to be gazed upon remains the center of our history. This human face is the fullness toward which history is moving. It is the mystery of recapitulation, the certainty that the Father has decreed to bring all things, those in heaven and those on earth, back to Christ, the one head, quoting Ephesians 1:10. In this plan, nothing will be lost that is authentically human. Indeed, everything will be purified and reunited in the one who gathers every fragment of life, every tear, and every authentically human achievement, rescuing them from nothingness and delivering them redeemed to the Father. This is a beautiful summary of, I think, his entire point. That's, to me, another key paragraph. But let us end with 239. He says, let us cultivate relationships. In an era that favors speed and fragmentation, the human person still yearns to receive care and recognition from attentive minds, kind words, and hands capable of tenderness. The digital culture multiplies connections and offers new opportunities for interaction, yet the human heart retains an irrevocable need for genuine closeness. I invite everyone to cherish places and times where physical presence remains crucial, such as shared meals, Christian community gatherings, time spent with the lonely, and serving the poor. These are signs of a humanity that continues to believe that every person's body is a dwelling place of God and a temple of the Holy Spirit. It is precisely this covenant between glory and fragility that becomes the criterion for evaluating the anthropological models offered by contemporary culture. And so Leo closes by saying, I entrust our desire to the Mother of Christ, to the woman of the Magnificat, that she may guide our steps through this time of change and preserve in each of us true faith in the gospel, so that we may bear witness to the grandeur of humanity in which God has made his dwelling. Given at Rome, at St. Peter's, on the 15th of May, in the year 2026, in the second of my pontificate, Leo XIV. Stupendous example of Catholic social teaching, and worthy of the many discussions that it will inaugurate, and hopefully change that we can all appreciate.